Let the day go now. Let your breath slow, your thoughts loosen. It's time to drift, not away from meaning, but into it. Tonight, we travel far, across thousands of years, to a world carved from stone and sand, to a place where empires rose and fell beneath the same sun that warms your window today. This is the ancient world. The morning begins not with songbirds or soft linens, but with the distant beat of sandals on dry earth, the low murmur of water being drawn from a well, and the dull ache of a woman waking to another day she does not control. She lies on a thin mat, in a room that breathes dust. Light seeps through the cracks in the wall, yellow, warm, and pitiless. She rises without hesitation. There is no room for lingering, no space for dreams. Her feet are bare. The floor is cold. She wraps her body in layers of linen worn thin by use and time. There is no privacy, not for her. She shares the space with siblings, cousins, elders. Her breath is quiet. Her thoughts are quieter. Outside, the village stirs. Smoke curls upward from clay ovens. Goats bleat. Children begin to argue. But she moves without speaking. She knows what is expected. The tasks change with the seasons, but the pattern does not. If she is young, her day begins with grinding grain. 2 stones, rough and heavy, worked back and forth with steady rhythm. The dust from the flour coats her hands, her arms, her face. There is no music, only the scrape of stone and the soft thud of her breath in her chest. If she is older, the tasks are heavier. Hauling water from the river, weaving baskets or cloth, cleaning, mending, boiling, sweeping, all done beneath a sun that offers no shade and no kindness. If she is married, her burdens multiply. She tends to children, elders, and the moods of a husband. She prepares food she will eat last, cleans a house she did not choose, and answers questions with silence. No one asks her what she wants. No one ever has. Not her father, not the priest, not the man who decided she would marry at 13. If she is childless, the whispers follow her. Not openly, never boldly, but always there. In the way women glance, in the way men pause when passing, as if her worth were measured in wombs, as if her body had failed at its only real task. If she has many children, the weight is different. She worries about food, about illness, about growing too fast and dying too young. She watches their faces for signs of favor, or disobedience, or danger. She holds them close when she can, but she knows she cannot always keep them. The temple looms in her life, even if she never enters. It sets the rhythm of festivals, offerings, and rules. There are gods for every part of life: birth, crops, sun, rain, but none that truly listen. Not to her. She may be told that women are sacred, that they are vessels, givers of life. But when decisions are made about land, about law, about futures, she is not in the room. She is not asked. She is not told. She is simply moved, like clay beneath someone else's hand. She speaks little in public. She walks with her eyes low. She knows which paths are safe and which doors are not for her. She learns to avoid attention, to blend into the rhythm of the day, to protect herself through invisibility. But there are moments, small ones, quiet rebellions, a glance that lingers too long, a word muttered beneath her breath, a line added to a weaving that tells a story no one else will see. She finds joy, too, though it is hard-won, in the laughter of another woman over shared bread, in the coolness of water poured over tired feet, in the moment her child sleeps against her chest and the world feels still. The heat presses in. Her muscles ache. Her ears ring with the noise of a dozen lives packed into one narrow space. She is not alone, but she is rarely seen. The evening comes without permission. The sky turns the color of ash. She prepares the final meal, cleans again, listens again. If the men speak of politics or war, she remains silent. If the boys boast or argue, she nods. She teaches through gesture, through repetition, through endurance. At night, she returns to her mat. The dust has settled again. The wind has died. She lies still. Her eyes trace the shape of the roof. There are no books, no letters, no stories written in her name. But her story exists in the lines on her hands, in the rhythm of her walk, in the way she survives another day without complaint. She closes her eyes. Her body is tired, but her thoughts do not sleep. They drift, slowly, back to the girl she once was, and forward towards daughters not yet born. The world does not change easily, but inside her there is memory. There is fire, and though no statue will bear her name, no scroll will record her words, she has shaped the world quietly with every silent sacrifice. And now, as the ancient city fades into night, as the moon rises over clay rooftops and quiet courtyards, she exhales and disappears softly into the long hush of history. The sun sits high now. The dust no longer settles. It hovers, motionless, in the golden light. Time moves slowly in the ancient world, but it does not stop, and neither does she. Her day is ruled by customs written long before her birth, by men she never met, and laws she never read. But she follows them perfectly, silently, because deviation is danger, and obedience is the path to survival. She knows how to walk in public, head low, steps quiet, eyes forward. She knows what colors not to wear, what gestures to avoid, what tone her voice must never take. She knows which men she must speak to, and which she must never even acknowledge. She knows how many steps to take from the market to her home, and how to carry the basket so that nothing draws attention. She does not ask why the rules exist. She cannot. No one would answer. The elders say it is the way of the gods. The priests say it is for the order of the world. The men say it is for her protection. But none of these voices ask her if she feels safe. She watches the men gather at gates, in temples, in courts, their voices rising with purpose, their hands gesturing over maps, goods, decrees. They make decisions about land, about punishments, about taxes, marriages, and borders, and they do it as if the lives of women are not affected. Sometimes she is allowed to watch from the side, quietly. If she speaks, the words are not recorded. If she is wise, her wisdom is ignored. If she is angry, it is dangerous. She remembers the stories she was told as a child, of goddesses with power, of queens with armies, of women who changed the course of fate. But those are stories. In her world, power does not wear a woman's face. Justice is shaped like a man's hand, and memory forgets the names of women long before it forgets the names of kings. When she bleeds, she hides. When she gives birth, she screams into cloth. Pain is private. Joy is quiet. Grief is carried in the curve of her back, in the tired way she folds linens, in the sighs she never lets escape. And yet she knows things, deep things. She knows how to read the sky for weather, how to feel the temperature of water, how to sense danger in a voice. She knows when a child is sick before the fever comes. She knows when a neighbor is pregnant before it is said. She knows the weight of silence between women. She knows what is not spoken. She is not taught to read, but she reads faces. She reads shadows. She reads between the lines of a conversation, and sometimes she reads dreams. In the dark, when the children sleep and the fires are low, she tells stories softly, barely louder than breath. Stories of spirits, of stars, of animals that speak. Stories that carry warnings in gentle rhythm. She weaves caution into tale and comfort into rhythm. These stories are not written in scrolls. They are passed mouth to mouth, woman to woman, like recipes, like lullabies, like truths the world was never ready to write down. And still, despite everything, she finds moments of laughter. At the well, while scrubbing clothes, someone says something wickedly funny, and she lets the joy rise from her chest before catching it, as if joy must not be seen in full. She smiles when her child pronounces a word wrong, when her sister drops the bread and pretends it's a game. There is resilience here, not loud, not defiant, but persistent. At night, she oils her hair with care, braids it tight so it does not tangle as she sleeps. She lies again on the mat. The roof has not changed. The walls still breathe dust, but her mind has traveled miles. She thinks of a life she will not live. A life where questions can be asked, where choices can be made, where stories begin with her name. The wind shifts outside. It carries the smell of olives, of firewood, of river mud. And still she lies there between what is and what will never be, waiting for sleep to find her, the way recognition never has. And as the night deepens and the city fades into a hush, she fades with it, quietly, completely, still bound by rules she did not write, in a world that never stopped to hear her voice. The sun now leans, heavy in the sky. The light shifts from gold to amber. The air thickens, not from wind, but from hours. She is tired, though the day is far from over. In the ancient world, the afternoon belongs to labor. And for women, labor is everywhere. There is no clock to stop it, only the steady pull of tasks that do not ask how she feels. She steps outside to wash. The clay jars are heavy. The water cool on her skin is a small kindness, one of few. She scrubs fabric against stone, her wrists already sore, but the rhythm is familiar. Children call to each other nearby, their play echoing between homes. She watches them briefly, just enough to smile, before returning to the basin. There is always something to clean, always something to make ready. Inside, the air is warmer. Food must be prepared. Bread, thick and flat. Lentils, boiled slow. Sometimes onions, sometimes olives. Meat is rare, spices rarer. She crushes herbs with a dull stone, adds a pinch of salt. These motions are inherited, passed down, not through words, but through watching, repeating, remembering. She listens for footsteps. The household breathes in unison. There is a rhythm to everything. When the men will return, when the silence must begin, when she must vanish into usefulness. A neighbor passes by the doorway. They exchange no words, only a glance, an entire conversation in a look. Did the child sleep? Did your husband strike? Did the midwife come? In that glance, understanding, sympathy, the kind of connection that forms only when life is carried in quiet suffering. She returns to the pot, stirs slowly, thinks of nothing in particular, and yet of everything. She thinks of her mother, and the way her hands moved through dough. She thinks of her grandmother, who once told her that patience was stronger than fire. She wonders if that is true. Sometimes she dreams of places she has never seen, oceans with no end, forests with tall trees, cool air and soft moss. But these are not for her. She was born for dust and sun, for hot kitchens and cold silences, for watching the sky shift colors while her hands stay busy. Still, there are moments she claims for herself. The way steam rises from hot bread, the sound of oil crackling in a pan, the soft sigh of a baby's breath against her shoulder. Small things, but they are hers. As the sun begins to fall lower, she wipes her hands and steps outside. The light has softened. Shadows stretch long. For a moment, the village feels quiet, like it is exhaling. She sits on a low stone, just for a minute. Her back aches. Her legs are tired. But for this minute, no one calls her name. No one asks. No one needs. She breathes deeply. The smell of earth. The hint of something sweet. Figs drying nearby, maybe. She lets herself imagine, just briefly, what it would be like to be born in another time. A time where questions are allowed, where women speak freely, where the world listens. But she does not linger. The pot must not burn. The table must be set. The evening must begin. She rises slowly, dusts off her hands, and steps back into the quiet work of staying invisible. It was not just daily labor or the burden of expectations that made life difficult for women in the ancient world. There were also deep restrictions on movement, silent rules embedded in society that said when and where a woman could go. In many ancient cities, women were not free to roam the streets or travel alone. If she walked through the marketplace, she was watched. If she spoke too loudly, she was judged. A woman's world was often limited to the walls of her home, and even then, she was never truly alone. There were eyes, expectations, invisible ropes that pulled her back any time she stepped forward. In some places, it was considered shameful for a woman to be seen outside too often, especially without a male companion. This didn't just limit her freedom, it shaped her very identity. To be a woman meant to exist in the background, to be quiet, to not take up space. This was the norm, passed down like an invisible cloak that daughters inherited from their mothers. It wasn't always forced with violence, though sometimes it was, but more often it was reinforced with customs and stories, with glances and silences, with soft commands and sharp consequences. Education, too, was a rare luxury for women in many parts of the ancient world. While boys were taught to read, write, argue, and calculate, girls were often taught how to spin thread, or keep the fire going, or serve food gracefully. Learning to read was not seen as necessary for a girl, unless she was from a wealthy or priestly family, and even then her knowledge was limited to what was considered appropriate. In some cultures, educated women were viewed with suspicion. A woman who read books was thought to be dangerous, even unnatural, as though knowledge might unmake her softness, or worse, inspire rebellion. But of course, intelligence is not limited by gender. Even in these quiet corners of history, some women did learn. Some watched their brothers recite poetry and memorized it in secret. Some listened outside temple walls, gathering stories like fallen petals, one by one. They taught themselves quietly in the shadows of classrooms they were not allowed to enter. And though their names were rarely recorded and their words often lost, the spark of thought endured. Still, it is heartbreaking to know how many minds were never allowed to bloom, how many questions went unasked, how many gifts were left unopened simply because the world did not believe women needed to learn. Then there was the matter of health. The female body, in all its mystery, was often misunderstood in the ancient world. Much of what was believed about women's health was based on superstition, not science. Menstruation was seen as impure. Childbirth was both feared and revered, and fertility was a subject of endless anxiety. A woman who could not bear children was often blamed, regardless of the real cause. She might be whispered about, pitied, or even sent away. Meanwhile, the pain and risk of childbirth were accepted as natural burdens. There was no real anesthesia, no sterile tools, no modern medicine. A woman in labor had only the hands of other women and prayers to gods who may or may not have been listening. Childbirth could mean life or death. It was a threshold, and every time a woman crossed it, she did so not knowing if she would return. And even if she survived, the expectations began immediately. Feed the baby, care for it, return to work. There was little rest. Her value was often tied to how many children she could bring into the world and how many of them survived. If a child died, it was her sorrow to carry, but also sometimes her blame to bear. The grief was deep and often silent, tucked away behind everyday chores. And still women endured. They endured the silence, the pain, the confinement, not because they were weak, but because they were expected to be strong in ways that were never celebrated. Their resilience was quiet, unnoticed, taken for granted. And even today, when we read about ancient societies and their accomplishments, we often read about kings and warriors, builders and philosophers. Rarely do we hear the stories of the women who made the bread, who lit the lamps, who kept the fire of life burning through the darkest nights. And yet their presence was everywhere, in every home, in every field, in every birth and burial. They were the silent foundation on which these civilizations stood. But history, as it is so often written, did not carve their names into stone. It let them fade like the edges of old scrolls, frayed and forgotten. And so when we speak now of how difficult it was to be a woman in the ancient world, we are not just talking about hardship. We are talking about absence, about voices that were not heard, about lives that were lived fully and fiercely, but without recognition. Still, there is a strange kind of peace in returning to their memory, in imagining them, not as victims, but as women who persisted in a world that tried to erase them. They were not perfect, and neither was their world, but they mattered. And though the records are faint and the names are few, their stories deserve to be told, even if only as a soft murmur before sleep.
There were also laws, so many laws, rules that wrapped themselves around a woman's life like vines, sometimes gentle, sometimes strangling. In many ancient societies, a woman was not seen as a full legal person. She could not own property outright. She could not testify in court without a male relative. Her words, even when honest and clear, were not always enough. The law treated her as someone who needed guidance, control, or protection, not as someone who could choose, decide, or act independently. Marriage, for instance, was rarely about love. It was a contract, a transaction, a negotiation between families. A woman was often married young, before she had time to understand what it meant. Sometimes she was given in exchange for land, livestock, or alliances. She might not even meet her future husband until the day of the wedding. And once married, she became part of another household, not as a partner, but as a piece of it. Her loyalty was expected, her silence assumed, her obedience required. Divorce, if allowed at all, was usually in the hands of the husband. A man could send his wife away for many reasons: infertility, disobedience, bad omens. A woman, on the other hand, might have no legal path to leave, even if she was mistreated or unloved. In some places, she had to return to her father's house in shame, if she was permitted to return at all. In others, she might be left without any home, her reputation tattered by something as simple as speaking too freely or failing to bear a child. Religious life could offer a few women a different path, but not always a kinder one. In temples and sacred spaces, some women served as priestesses or ritual attendants. These roles were respected in name, but often came with restrictions. Some were required to remain celibate, isolated from the world. Others performed rituals that were misunderstood by outsiders and sometimes feared. And in some places, what was called sacred could also be cruel. Young women dedicated to the gods, cut off from family, chosen not by desire, but by tradition or force. Their lives, while different from those of wives and mothers, were not always freer. Public voice was another thing denied to most women. In forums, councils, assemblies, where ideas were shared and decisions made, women's seats were often empty. Not because they didn't care or couldn't think, but because they were not invited. Their voices were kept for lullabies, for whispered prayers, for quiet songs sung while grinding grain or washing clothes. Rarely were they allowed to speak where history was being shaped. And yet, despite all of this, women found ways to influence the world around them. Not through grand speeches or bold proclamations, but through persistence, presence, and patience. In their homes, they passed down stories and songs, taught children to read and remember, tended to wounds, both physical and emotional. In markets, they bartered and bargained with sharp eyes and sharper minds. And sometimes, through cleverness and quiet resistance, they changed the course of small things, just enough to matter. But this kind of influence rarely made it into the scrolls of history. The deeds of men were written in ink. The lives of women were often remembered in silence. Generations passed, and the pattern held. For every queen whose name we remember, there were thousands of women whose names were never recorded. They cooked, cleaned, carried water, and bore children, and their labor was invisible. But without it, no civilization could have stood. In times of war, women often suffered most and spoke least. When cities were invaded, they became spoils. When fathers and husbands went to battle, women stayed behind, exposed and unprotected. Sometimes they defended their homes with nothing but determination. Other times they simply endured, hoping to survive long enough to rebuild. Their courage was not praised with monuments. Their grief was not honored with ceremonies. But still, they endured. And in stories passed down through generations, told around fires, whispered in kitchens, there were hints of resistance, of women who refused to be quiet, who found ways to push back, maybe not through armies or rebellion, but through cleverness, wisdom, and love. The kind of quiet strength that history forgets, but life depends on. As you lie here drifting slowly into rest, imagine them, not as victims, but as witnesses, as people who saw the world clearly, even when the world refused to see them. Their silence was not consent. Their absence from the records was not absence from life. They were there, always there, in the corners, behind the curtains, holding the threads together. The ancient world was hard, it was cruel, and for women it was even harder. But still they lived, still they dreamed, still they loved, taught, wept, laughed, and hoped. That hope, that quiet, stubborn hope, has never left us. It lives on, even now, in the soft hum of history as you begin to fall asleep.
Across the ancient world, from dusty hills to marble cities, women lived lives shaped by forces far beyond their choosing. Nature, tradition, belief, and power. These were the hands that carved the space a woman was allowed to occupy. Often that space was small, a quiet corner of a house, a patch of soil behind the home, a stool by the fire. It was in these spaces that so much of life happened, not with fanfare, not with applause, but with steady, careful repetition. There were, of course, differences from one culture to another. In some places, women had a little more room to breathe. In others, they were even more tightly bound. But the thread that ran through most of the ancient world was the same. A woman was expected to serve, to support, to endure, not to lead, not to question, not to be remembered. Take, for instance, the expectations around beauty. In many societies, a woman's appearance was not just personal, it was political. Her looks could determine her value, her marriage, her future. Elaborate beauty rituals were passed down from one generation to the next, not always for joy, but because to be plain was to risk invisibility or shame. Thick kohl lines, painted lips, perfumed oils, these were not always choices, but duties. And when a woman aged, as all do, her worth often seemed to fade in the eyes of those who once praised her youth. There was pressure, always pressure, to be lovely but modest, strong but never forceful, present but never loud. A woman in the ancient world had to walk a narrow path. One misstep could mean judgment, rejection, or worse. She was watched closely, not just by men, but by other women too. Society trained everyone to help enforce the rules, even those most harmed by them. Clothing told stories. In some cultures, women were veiled in public, not as a symbol of piety alone, but to mark their status, to hide them from the gaze of others. In others, they wore brightly dyed robes and gold bangles to display the wealth of their household. But even these choices, if they could be called choices, were dictated by men, by custom, by the need to belong and to survive. Within households, the hierarchy was clear. The oldest man held authority. Sons followed. Wives were expected to obey, and daughters to be silent until married off. But despite this rigid structure, homes were also places of quiet power. Women controlled the rhythms of daily life. They prepared the food, managed supplies, soothed fevers, wove cloth, and whispered wisdom into the ears of children. Theirs was the labor that never ended, and rarely was praised, but without it, nothing else functioned. Stories, when passed down, favored heroes, kings, and gods. Yet behind every great man, there was often a woman, sometimes a wife, sometimes a mother, sometimes a servant, whose influence shaped events invisibly. Her advice, her presence, her grief or courage could alter the path of history, even if no one wrote her name in ink. And so while history forgot her, life remembered. In art and sculpture, women were often idealized, portrayed as goddesses, muses, or symbols of fertility. But these images said little about real women's lives. The statues didn't capture their tired hands or sore feet. The paintings didn't show the heartbreak of losing a child.
or the quiet strength it took to survive another day with little food. The poems spoke of beauty, but not of effort, not of sacrifice. And what of joy? Did women in the ancient world feel joy? Of course they did. They laughed, they danced, they sang lullabies in the dark. They found delight in small things, in the smell of fresh bread, in the warmth of sunlight through a window, in the embrace of a child. They made jokes while working, hummed tunes while grinding grain, and shared secrets with friends while mending cloth. Even in hard lives, joy flickers. It always has. But the fact that they found joy does not mean their lives were easy. It means they were human. It means they resisted, not with swords or speeches, but with kindness, with creation, with care. These were their tools. This was their language. And though history did not always honor it, these acts mattered. Imagine now a woman sitting alone at the end of a long day. The fire is low, the children are asleep, the walls are quiet. She holds a bit of thread in her hand, winding it slowly, thinking of the days that have passed and the ones yet to come. Her face is tired, but thoughtful. She knows she will rise again tomorrow before the sun, as always. But for now, there is a moment of stillness. In that stillness, we meet her. We remember her, not just as a figure in a story, but as a real person, one whose life mattered even if the world forgot her name. And as you lie here now, listening, resting, drifting slowly toward sleep, perhaps you feel her presence too. Gentle, patient, enduring. She is part of the long thread that connects us all, through time, through silence, through love.
As the centuries turned, the shapes of temples, homes, and cities shifted, but the position of women in the ancient world remained much the same. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, as empires spread across continents and collapsed into dust, the life of a woman was still defined by patterns that rarely changed. She was expected to remain loyal, to labor without complaint, to live in the shadow of the men around her. And through all this, her story remained largely unrecorded, preserved only in fragments, scraps of pottery, lines in forgotten scrolls, hints carved into stone. Some of the oldest surviving laws speak volumes. They listed punishments for women who strayed from expected roles, but few protections. A woman accused of disobedience could be cast out, beaten, or worse. Her defense meant little unless echoed by a man of standing. Even in death, her name might be left off the family's records, unless she bore many sons or came from high birth. These silences tell us what history once valued and what it chose to ignore. Yet still, women survived. They adapted, quietly learning the rules so they might bend them just enough to find breath. In matriarchal households, sometimes built in distant villages or borderlands, older women held quiet power, offering guidance that shaped
generations. Through midwifery, song, herbcraft, and memory, they passed down more than knowledge. They passed down continuity. These were the unseen bridges that kept culture alive when cities burned or when rulers changed hands. Among those few whose names history preserved, we find glimpses of resistance. A poet who wrote verses to the moon in the still of night. A healer whose remedies eased pain, even when priests scoffed. A scribe's daughter who copied texts at candlelight, leaving tiny notes in the margins. These women were not rebels in the way we think of them today. They were simply people who saw that the world could be more than what it offered them, and quietly carved out small spaces of freedom within it. But for most women, daily life left little time for dreams. There was water to carry, fields to tend, children to soothe, wool to spin. The rhythm of survival left little room for questions. It was enough just to endure. And yet, in this quiet endurance, there was a kind of strength that the world overlooked, a patience, a persistence, a deep-rootedness that outlasted many of the structures built to contain them. Think now of an ordinary woman in an ordinary village. She waits before the sun, with aching joints and a full day ahead. She tends the fire, kneads bread, washes linens, and listens to her children's stories as they prepare for the day. Her hands are rough, her back is sore, but her heart carries songs her mother once sang. No one will write her story, but she is the backbone of her world. Her love, her labor, her presence, these are the things that hold the home together, and by extension, the village, the city, the empire. History may call her invisible, but invisibility is not the same as absence. She was there in every era, in every culture, shaping the lives of others through the simple act of care. It may not have looked heroic, it may not have seemed important, but it mattered. And there were dangers, always. Illness without medicine, childbirth without aid, hunger, violence, abandonment. A woman without protection could lose everything: her home, her dignity, her life. And yet, even in such conditions, many found ways to help one another. Networks of care formed quietly, like threads in a woven cloth. Neighbors offered food. Elders shared knowledge. A song passed from lips to lips became comfort when all else failed. In many ancient cultures, these networks were sacred. Women's gatherings were not only for gossip or work, but they were spaces of shared knowledge. How to calm a fever, how to read the sky, how to dry herbs for winter, how to grieve together. These spaces were often overlooked by the outside world, but inside them lived generations of wisdom, passed not through books, but through hands, hearts, and voices. We often think of history as grand events, battles, crowns, declarations. But the truth is, much of life happens in the quiet places. And much of what kept ancient society alive was done by those whose names we'll never know. So tonight, as the world grows still around you, allow your breath to soften. Picture not the throne rooms or war councils of old, but the small hearths, the quiet kitchens, the candle-lit corners where women once worked, watched, and waited. Their work was never flashy, but it was unending. Their stories may not fill textbooks, but they fill the foundations of every human story. And perhaps that is why we tell them now. Not with loud voices or sharp details, but with a soft murmur, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Because their lives mattered. Because without them, none of the rest could have stood. As your eyelids grow heavier, imagine her, any one of them, all of them, sitting in the soft light of dawn, wrapping bread in cloth, touching the cheek of a sleeping child, whispering a prayer into the morning air. That is history too, and perhaps the most enduring.
Though the world of the ancients has long faded, covered by centuries of dust and silence, the echoes of women's lives still linger quietly just beneath the surface. Their voices are not loud. They are like soft winds that move through ruins, brushing gently across broken columns and worn paths. And if we are still enough, if we listen closely, we can almost hear them. The lull of their songs, the rhythm of their work, the heartbeat of their hope. In the earliest myths, women were sometimes given divine forms, goddesses of fertility, of earth, of wisdom. But even these celestial figures were bound by rules. Often they were praised for beauty or motherhood, not for their minds or will. Even among the divine, a woman's worth was often tied to her ability to nurture, to submit, or to sacrifice. Rarely did myths celebrate women for leading, building, or questioning. Those who did were often punished, turned into stone, cast into exile, or simply written out of the story altogether. The same myths that thrilled audiences around ancient fires also shaped how real women were treated. Stories carried weight. They taught people what to admire, what to fear, and what to expect. And in these stories, women were rarely the hero. They were helpers, lovers, healers, or obstacles, always near power, but rarely holding it. And still, in quiet corners of time, women resisted, not with swords or battles, but with memory. They remembered the old ways. They remembered which plants healed wounds, which songs calmed restless minds, which patterns in the stars signaled changes in season.
This remembering, so often overlooked, was a kind of resistance. In preserving what the world did not write down, they held on to wisdom that might have vanished forever. In some cultures, women were midwives of both life and death. They helped babies enter the world, and they washed bodies before burial. They were there at the beginning and the end, steady as stones. Their presence brought comfort. Their hands held knowledge passed from woman to woman, not through scrolls, but through touch, through watching, through time. Imagine for a moment a gathering of women in an ancient village. The sun has set. A fire flickers in the center. Around it, older women mend baskets and hum old songs. Younger ones listen, learning without being taught. A girl weaves a string of beads while her mother braids her hair. No one speaks loudly, yet so much is shared. These moments, though small, shaped generations. They were classrooms, sanctuaries, homes. But these scenes were rarely recorded. The ancient world did not see value in such gatherings. It measured importance by war and wealth, not by care and connection. And so the daily acts of women, washing, weaving, tending, teaching, were ignored by history's pen, but they were never forgotten by life itself. In times of famine or plague, it was often women who rationed food, who cared for the sick, who made do with little. They stretched cloth, made new from old, turned scraps into meals. Their ingenuity was born from necessity, and their strength was quiet but constant. It was not the strength of conquerors, but of keepers, those who held families and communities together when the world threatened to fall apart. Sometimes there were glimmers of recognition, a queen whose wisdom guided a kingdom, a healer whose remedies cured the untreatable, a poet whose verses survived through whispered repetition. But for every one woman whose name reached us, thousands more lived and died in obscurity, deserving of remembrance, but lost to time. And so we speak of them now, not to tell a story with a clear beginning or end, but to simply hold space for their existence, to say that they were here, that they mattered, that their lives, though small in the eyes of history, were vast in the ways that count. Every meal prepared, every child comforted, every wound tended, every song sung in darkness, these were acts of humanity, of resilience, of meaning. As you rest now, picture one such woman, not royal or famous, but ordinary and strong. Perhaps she is sitting by a river, her hands in the water, washing a child's tunic. The sun is low, the day almost done. She looks up for a moment and sees birds crossing the sky. She smiles, not because life is easy, but because in that moment it is peaceful. She has done her part. She will do it again tomorrow. This is the heartbeat of history too, not the roar of armies, but the hush of evening, not the clatter of empires, but the soft rustle of a woman folding linens, whispering to herself as the fire dims. This is where life happens. This is where the world is held together. So let this part of the story carry you deeper into rest. Let the quiet strength of ancient women settle around you like a blanket. Their burdens were many, their voices hushed, but their spirit never faded. Even now, as your breath slows and your thoughts drift, they are with you, in memory, in legacy, in the long, unbroken thread of care that stretches across time.
In every era, no matter how ancient or forgotten, women shaped the world in ways that were quiet, steady, and deeply human. And yet, the record of their existence is scattered, written not in stone, but in soft traces that time tried to erase. A worn path between homes, a comb left buried in clay, a lullaby remembered without knowing who first sang it. These are the fingerprints of women across the centuries, subtle, endearing, and sacred in their own way. Their lives were marked by repetition, the same gestures, day after day, kneading bread, stitching garments, combing tangles from a child's hair. They poured water from the same jug, swept the same floor, folded the same cloth again and again. To the outside world, it may have seemed like nothing, but within that repetition lived love, devotion, and care, expressed not through grand acts, but through unwavering presence. Many women in the ancient world never traveled far. Their entire lives unfolded within a few familiar walls. Yet within those boundaries, they nurtured entire generations. They taught language before books existed. They healed fevers with herbs gathered by hand. They explained the stars with stories passed down by mouth, not ink. They sang songs to babies that had been sung for 100 years before, and would be sung 100 more. The seasons ruled their time. In spring, seeds were planted with careful hands. In summer, the sun dried herbs hanging from beams. In autumn, food was preserved for the lean months. In winter, by the hearth, they worked by firelight, mending clothing or spinning thread. Their hands were always busy, always knowing what needed to be done next. And though they received little praise, their labor made life possible. Sometimes, during rare moments of stillness, women dreamed, not always of escape or glory, but of ease, of safety, of knowing that those they loved would survive another season. These quiet dreams were often unspoken. The world did not ask what women wanted.
but still the longing lived inside them, a longing for fairness, for rest, for recognition, for softness in a world that demanded so much. In many ancient cultures, women's wisdom was passed through objects. A woven pattern in cloth might carry a message. A painted jar might contain symbols meant to bless or protect. The things they made were not only useful, they were meaningful. Functional beauty, crafted with care. Even when made in silence, their creations told stories, not with words, but with threads, color, and shape. Their art, like their lives, was often anonymous, but deeply personal. They also knew how to listen. In the midst of chaos, arguments, illness, uncertainty, women were often the ones who stayed calm, who offered comfort, who knew what to do when no one else did. They were not trained warriors or scholars, but they had deep knowledge of people, of patterns, of pain, and that wisdom, earned through generations of living and watching, was passed not in lectures, but in glances, gestures, and whispered advice. In some places, women held sacred roles. They guarded temples, performed rituals, and interpreted dreams. These were rare honors, often surrounded by heavy rules. But even here, the theme was the same. The world respected what women could give, but rarely who they were. Their value was tied to service, to others, to gods, to tradition. Rarely were they free simply to be. And yet, despite this, they continued. Through hardship and hunger, through birth and loss, through loneliness and laughter, their strength was not loud or showy. It did not need to be. It was there, in every gentle hand, every steady breath, every night spent watching over a sick child while the world slept on. Think now of a simple scene. A woman sits on a stool at the end of the day. Her hands rest in her lap. A bowl of lentils cools beside her. The wind moves softly through the window. There is no crown on her head, no title before her name. But she is the reason the home still stands. Her work is done for now, and in the quiet she closes her eyes, not to escape, but to rest, to feel the calm she has earned. These are the stories we rarely hear, not because they didn't happen, but because they were never written. But now, in the silence of night, we honor them. We bring them back, not in full detail, but in spirit. We remember the unseen, the unnamed, the uncelebrated, not with noise or grand gestures, but with stillness, with breath, with sleep. As your eyes grow heavier, imagine them around you, a circle of women from across time, each with her own burdens and joys. They do not ask for thanks. They do not seek glory. They simply remain, quiet witnesses to the past, silent keepers of endurance, strength,
and care. Let their presence soothe you. Let their stories rest beside yours. You do not need to understand every detail. You need only to feel the rhythm, the soft heartbeat of lives lived in quiet service, in gentle resistance, in lasting love.
The world kept turning. Empires rose and crumbled. Roads stretched farther. Temples reached higher. But the daily life of a woman, her breath, her burdens, her hopes, remained much the same. Across centuries and civilizations, she was still expected to care for others first, and for herself only if there was time. Often, there wasn't. In many ancient cities, streets bustled with trade, debate, and ritual. Men filled the forums and courts, discussed politics, war, and philosophy. But behind the walls of homes, behind curtains and courtyards, the quieter labor continued. Women worked in silence, tending to bodies and spaces, maintaining order while chaos ruled beyond the gate. These homes were not just places of rest. They were workshops, clinics, classrooms, and kitchens. Within their walls, life was stitched together with hands that seldom paused. A woman might rise before the light and fall into sleep long after the embers died down. No part of the day truly belonged to her, but she filled every part of it. Some women worked in public too. Vendors at markets, weavers in stalls, performers in traveling troupes. But visibility did not always mean dignity. To work outside the home could mean judgment. It could mean risk. The boundaries between respect and shame were thin and decided by others. A woman was often praised for sacrifice, yet punished for seeking independence. And still, many did. They learned to move carefully, to speak with measured words, to offer their opinions in the form of questions. But in their hearts, many held thoughts as sharp and clear as any philosopher's. They observed quietly. They remembered everything. And though their wisdom was rarely sought in public, it shaped every corner of private life. Illness, hunger, misfortune, these arrived without warning. When they did, it was the woman who responded first. She knew which herbs to boil, which neighbors to ask, how to stretch flour for another day. She knew how to soothe a restless child, how to comfort a dying parent, how to hold the weight of grief without collapsing under it. This knowledge was not praised in stone or bronze. It lived in the breath between tasks, passed from mother to daughter like a sacred thread. In the ancient world, silence was often mistaken for submission. But silence can also be strength. The quiet acceptance of hardship, the calm beneath storms, the choice to survive, even when there seems no reward for doing so. In that silence lived a power too deep for words. And sometimes, in the gentlest moments, that power became beauty. Not the beauty of painted lips or gilded hair, but the beauty of presence, of stillness, of care given without demand. When a woman held the hand of a frightened child or hummed softly to ease someone into sleep, she reminded the world, without saying a word,
that compassion is older than any empire. There were friendships, too, bonds formed between women who worked side by side, who shared stories while grinding grain or drawing water. These relationships were lifelines, forged in repetition, strengthened by shared burdens. A glance, a touch on the shoulder, a shared smile, these became comfort in a world that asked so much and gave so little in return. And laughter was never far. Even in hardship, women found ways to laugh about the small absurdities of daily life, about the things men never noticed, about themselves. This humor was not loud or cruel, it was gentle, knowing, healing, a private language spoken only between those who understood. As the sun set and shadows lengthened across stone streets and open fields, women lit lamps and prepared for another night. They told stories to children, tucked in blankets, cleared away the remains of dinner. They moved through their routines not as servants of fate, but as quiet guardians of continuity. They were the thread that wove each day to the next. And now, as you lie here, breathing slowly, safely, imagine them not as relics of a faraway time, but as echoes within you. Their strength lives in your stillness. Their care lives in the way you breathe. Their presence, though unnamed, continues in every small act of peace, of patience, of love. You do not need to remember each name, each place, each law. You only need to remember the feeling, that warm, steady rhythm of lives lived with grace even in difficulty. That is the story. That is the history. And it is not boring at all. It is full of quiet courage. Let it cradle you now. Let it carry you toward rest. The night is long, but gentle, and you are not alone.
Night in the ancient world brought with it a different kind of stillness. One not just of quiet, but of waiting. The lamps would burn low, fires flicker to embers, and the world would seem to pause, suspended in a hush that wrapped around homes and villages like a soft veil. For women, night was not always a time of rest. Often, it was simply a continuation of the day's quiet vigilance. Children might wake crying from fever. A husband might return from the tavern in foul temper. Livestock might stir or fall ill. Sleep was rarely uninterrupted. But in those brief moments between tending, between worry and labor, there was sometimes space to exhale. A woman might lie back, eyes tracing the ceiling beams or the stars beyond the window, and let her thoughts wander. She would not have called herself a philosopher. She had no scrolls, no tutors, no public to hear her ideas, and yet, in her own mind, she may have asked the same questions the great thinkers posed. Why does suffering exist? What happens after death? Is love a duty or a gift? These were not idle thoughts, but private truths formed in the long silence of work and waiting. If she had someone to confide in, a sister, a mother, an old friend, they might whisper together after the rest of the house had gone quiet. In these late hours, honesty came more easily. Fears about childbirth, worries about food, dreams too delicate to name in daylight. The night softened everything, even sorrow. Some women learned to read, though they were few. Perhaps the daughter of a scribe, allowed to copy lines for practice. Perhaps a priestess taught the sacred words. To read was a kind of magic, the ability to take symbols and unlock meaning, to trace thoughts from someone far away or long gone. A woman who could read might write her thoughts in a hidden place, on wax tablets, in the margins of old scrolls, or even scratched into clay. But most had only memory. Their thoughts lived in songs, in prayers, in the stories they told their children. These stories weren't always grand myths or lessons. Sometimes they were simply memories, how the rain came late one year, or how their mother once healed a burn with honey. These memories became wisdom, passed along not to teach, but to keep company, a form of gentle companionship through the generations. And through it all, women held time. Not the measured time of sundials or calendars, but the softer kind. Time as rhythm. The timing of bread rising. The days between planting and sprouting. The hours of labor before birth. The cycles of the moon. Their bodies themselves were clocks, their lives shaped by patterns older than writing. Yet this closeness to the body, to nature, to rhythm, also brought risk. If a woman's body failed, if she couldn't bear children, or bled too long, or grew ill without explanation, she might be shunned or blamed. Misfortune was often seen as fault. A woman's body, sacred and strong, was also a source of mystery and fear to the world around her. And what is feared is often controlled. Even in the most advanced cities, where aqueducts ran and columns gleamed, the experience of being a woman could still mean pain in silence. There were no anesthetics, no trained doctors who truly understood a woman's suffering. Labor was endured without aid. Illness was treated with guesswork. Many died young, their names lost even to their children's children. But those who lived, those who grew old, became keepers of knowledge. A grandmother's word might carry the weight of truth. She had seen famine, birth, storms, illness, healing, love, and loss. She had survived, and in her survival, she became a quiet archive of the human spirit. Picture her now, wrinkled hands folded in her lap, eyes that had watched generations pass before her. She does not speak much anymore, but her silence is not empty. It is full of things that need no words. She watches the young ones rush and worry. She sees the world changing, but she knows the rhythm beneath it all is the same. And this, perhaps, is the heart of the ancient woman's experience. The world around her might shift, rulers, gods, languages, laws, but her life followed a deeper current, one rooted in care, in endurance, in the long weaving of connection that stretched far beyond her own lifetime. She did not ask to be remembered. She asked only that those she loved be safe, be fed, be sheltered. And in this, her legacy remains, not in monuments, but in motion, in the hands that cook, that comfort, that tend, in the eyes that watch over others, in the breath of those who pause, even now, to remember. So as you rest, let the quiet strength of these women surround you. Let their patience become your calm,
Let their rhythm slow your thoughts. The world does not need your worry. It only asks that you breathe, gently, in and out. That you remember, in your own way, the long line of lives that made your life possible. The night is deep, but it is kind. You are held in history's softest hands.
As centuries turned and generations quietly folded into one another, the roles of women remained deeply rooted in repetition, in care, and in silence. But within that stillness, there was motion, a kind of slow and steady persistence that could not be undone by time. It was the kind of presence that did not need to be declared in words. It simply existed, like the turning of the earth, like the slow shifting of stars overhead. For many women in the ancient world, their days began before the sun and ended long after its light had faded. There were no clocks to dictate their hours, only the needs of those around them. A cry in the night, a spill to clean, a garment to mend. Their labor was woven so closely into the rhythm of daily life that it was often invisible. But without it, the world would have unraveled. Some women lived in simple homes, walls made of mud or stone, roofs patched with straw. Others moved through grander spaces, with servants and pillars, mosaic floors, and painted walls. But whether in wealth or poverty, the expectations were much the same. A woman was to be still, obedient, industrious. Her worth was measured not in her thoughts, but in her usefulness, in how quietly she endured. Marriage was not always a choice. In many places, it was an arrangement made early, before she had learned what it meant to love or to live. Girls might be promised before their voices had fully settled. They were often handed from one household to another, not as people, but as promises, bridges between families, symbols of peace or profit. Few were asked how they felt about the life ahead. Fewer still were given a path to say no. Once wed, a woman became part of another's story. Her name might change. Her household surely would. She was expected to bear children, especially sons, and to care for everyone else first. Her pain was hers to carry. Her dreams, if she had any, were often left at the door. And yet, many women found strength in one another. A sister-in-law, a neighbor, an elder. These were often the only refuge from the demands of family and fate. They shared stories in hushed tones, offered advice by the fire, and laughed quietly when the men were away. These bonds were not always visible to outsiders, but they were vital. They reminded women that they were not alone in their struggles. Women were the first to hear a newborn's cry. They were the last to close the eyes of the dying. They bore witness to every stage of life, often without praise,
often without pause. Their knowledge came not from books, but from experience. They learned how to read a fever, how to calm a restless heart, how to stretch a little food into a full meal. This wisdom was passed hand to hand through touch, through story, through time. And still, there were moments of beauty. A child's smile, a shared song, the softness of newly spun wool, the light falling just right across a woven mat. These small details gave life its shape. They gave it warmth. Even in the hardest seasons, women found ways to nurture gentleness. In certain cultures, women found quiet ways to influence the world around them. Through the raising of children, through the management of the home, through stories, rituals, and song. These were not public acts. They were not recorded in scrolls or carved into stone, but they shaped hearts, they shaped minds, and slowly they shaped the world. Imagine one woman sitting alone beside a clay lamp. Her children sleep nearby. Her hands are rough from work, but gentle in rest. She watches the flame flicker and thinks not of glory, but of the next morning, what she will cook, what she must clean, what she hopes will grow. This too is a kind of courage. This too is a life that matters. The ancient world was not kind to women, and yet women remained kind to the world. They softened its edges, cared for its sick, held its secrets, and kept it moving forward. Their names may be lost, their faces may be unknown, but their presence is felt still in every act of quiet strength. As your eyes grow heavier now, know that you are resting in a long tradition of care, a tradition built by hands that never stopped working, hearts that never stopped hoping. The past may be full of hardship, but it is also full of tenderness, woven, spun, and held by women who lived in the shadows of history, yet shaped its very soul. Let their memory cradle you now. Let their rhythm guide your breath. The night is here, and it is soft. You have done enough. You are enough. And the story will wait until morning.
In the gentle hush of ancient mornings, when the world was still gray with mist, and the fires had not yet been stirred, a woman would rise from her mat or her pile of woven blankets, quietly moving through the space she knew by heart. There were no alarms, no clocks, only the rhythm of life itself. Sunlight seeping in through cracks in the walls, the soft stir of animals, the breath of sleeping children. She began her day the same way she had begun every day before, by tending to others first. It might have been grinding grain by hand, kneeling beside the hearth to coax embers back to life, or preparing water warmed over stones. The tasks did not change, but within that sameness was a kind of quiet purpose. She moved with knowing hands, as if the motions were stitched into her bones. For women in the ancient world, labor was not measured in hours or wages. It was constant, expected, and often unnoticed. There were no holidays from care, no reward for endurance. But still they labored, not only for survival, but for comfort, for warmth in winter, for nourishment, for the well-being of those around them. In many cultures, women were also the keepers of birth and death. When a new life entered the world, it was women who gathered close, who whispered encouragement, who caught the infant in their arms. And when death came, it was often women who washed the body, who prepared it for burial, who wept openly when others could not. They stood at both thresholds, first breath and last death, and carried the weight of both with quiet grace. Even in times of war or great unrest, the role of women remained unchanged. While cities crumbled or rulers shifted, the daily care of life continued. Children still needed feeding, clothes still needed mending, wounds still needed cleaning. A woman's work was never put on pause, even when the world around her fell into chaos. In some communities, women held knowledge that others overlooked. They knew which herbs soothed fevers, which patterns in the sky signaled rain. They understood the changes in a child's cry, or the meaning of a long silence in a husband's voice. Their wisdom was practical, intimate, and essential, but often dismissed, because it was quiet, because it was close to the body, to the home, because it came without ceremony. And yet this knowledge endured, passed from mother to daughter, whispered during chores, wrapped inside lullabies. It was not written in scrolls or carved into stone, but it lasted longer than empires. These were the secrets of survival, of comfort, of love. The kind of knowing that doesn't seek attention, but keeps the world turning. At times, there were moments of rebellion, not loud, but certain. A woman who chose not to marry, a mother who taught her daughter to read, a widow who managed her household with confidence. These small acts, in a world that sought to contain them, were bold. They were rarely celebrated, but they mattered. Some women found joy in creation, in weaving patterns that told silent stories, in shaping clay into bowls that would pass through many hands, in singing as they worked. Their creativity was not framed and hung, but it lived in every useful thing made with care. It lived in motion, in repetition, in use. And sometimes women dreamed of a life less burdened, of walking freely through the streets, of speaking and being heard. These dreams were not always shared aloud, but they glimmered quietly beneath the surface like small flames that never quite went out. Even when the world pressed down, those dreams remained. Picture now a quiet courtyard. A fig tree leans into the sun. The air is warm, but the stone beneath the feet is cool. A woman sits with her back against the wall, her hands still for once.
She watches a bird hop along the edge of the water basin, and for a moment, just a moment, she is not a servant, not a wife, not a mother, just a soul at rest. A person in stillness, a quiet presence in a wide world. We rarely hear her story, but tonight we do. Let her presence guide your breath, let her strength soften your thoughts. The weight she carried is no longer hers alone. It has passed down through time not to burden you, but to remind you that care is a legacy, that quiet endurance has meaning, that softness is not weakness, but wisdom. As you lie here, safe and still, you carry forward something ancient and gentle. You become part of that long, slow rhythm of hands that give, of hearts that hold, of lives that heal. The past does not ask us to remember every name, only to remember that love, too, is a form of history, one that lives not in records, but in rest, in care, in the calm we allow ourselves at the end of the day. Close your eyes now. The story continues, but for tonight, there is nothing more you need to do.
The seasons turned slowly in the ancient world, guided by stars and the tilt of the earth. There were no calendars pinned to walls, no digital alerts or reminders, just the quiet signals of nature. A change in the wind, the arrival of certain birds, the color of leaves in the hills, and women, more than most, understood these signs. They had to. Their lives moved with the land. They knew the rhythm of planting and harvesting. They knew when to collect herbs before the sun reached its highest point, and when to let bread rise longer because the air was cooler. Their senses were finely tuned because survival depended on it. But with this closeness to nature also came risk. When the rains didn't fall, when disease swept through, when war passed too near, it was often the women who bore the first burden. They would stretch rations, mend what was broken, comfort those in fear, while pushing aside their own worries. Strength was not an option, it was a necessity. And still, in the midst of all this, they created moments of peace. A quiet meal arranged with care, a lullaby hummed over a restless child, a bath of warm water scented with crushed leaves. These gestures weren't grand, they weren't written down, but they softened the hardness of life. There was beauty in this effort, in the way women folded the cloth just so, in how they remembered every birthday, every wound, every favorite food, in how they noticed the little things that others overlooked. And though it was rarely acknowledged, this attention, this care held families together. Some women lived in towns, others in isolated farms. Some were wives. Some were daughters who never left their parents' homes. Some were slaves, others priestesses or healers. Their stations differed, their burdens varied, but they were bound by similar threads, the expectation to serve, to yield, to remain unseen except when needed. And yet, despite the limitations, many found small ways to shape their world. A mother might teach her daughter how to negotiate with traders. An older sister might pass along a secret recipe. A grandmother might tell tales that stirred something deeper, a sense of possibility, of quiet pride, of memory that refused to fade. These weren't revolutions, but they mattered. They were a form of resistance, made of whispers, of knowing glances, of care that reached beyond survival. There were also sacred spaces, places where women gathered, often out of sight, but not out of power. In some cultures, they danced together, sang together, bled together. The shared rituals of womanhood, birth, coming of age, mourning, created invisible ties, stronger than law. In those moments, a woman might feel seen, if only briefly. She might speak without fear, laugh freely, move without watching her own shadow. These glimpses of self were precious. They reminded her that her life was not only one of duty, but also of presence, that she was not only what others asked her to be, but someone whole and real, even if the world didn't notice. Imagine now a gathering of women at dusk. A small fire flickers, the scent of herbs fills the air. They sit in a circle, weaving, talking softly. Children play nearby, and the night hums with cicadas. No one gives speeches, no one records their words. But something important is being preserved. Not just memory, but connection. A recognition that they are not alone in their endurance. This is a history often lost, not because it lacked value, but because it lacked noise. It did not fight for attention. It simply kept going, day after day, year after year. And now, in this quiet moment of rest, you are part of that same history. You are breathing beneath the same stars. You are held by the same quiet strength. Close your eyes if they haven't already. Feel the stillness in your limbs. Let the breath come slowly, like waves returning to the shore. You are not expected to do anything now, only to rest, only to be. Let the memory of those women, unnamed, unpraised, but never important, surround you like a soft blanket. Let them carry your thoughts far from worry. Let them remind you that even the smallest life holds beauty. Even the softest voice leaves an echo. You are not alone. You never were.
As the day faded and long shadows reached across courtyards and rooftops, women in the ancient world often found themselves returning to the quiet rhythms of evening. The same hands that had prepared food, tended wounds, and cleaned every corner now worked more slowly, folding cloth, combing a child's hair, wiping dust from the windowsill with the last of the light. The world grew softer, and so did their movements. Evenings offered no promise of rest, but they did offer a certain gentleness. The heat of the sun was gone. The chores that could be delayed until morning were finally set aside. The air smelled of ash and herbs, and the sky turned from gold to lavender. It was in these moments, when the fire burned low and the room was quiet, that a woman might sit still, if only for a breath. She might look at her own hands and notice, perhaps, how they had changed. A new line across the knuckle, a scar from a slip of the knife, a memory tucked into every callus. Her hands had done so much, more than anyone ever said aloud.
and still they were expected to do more tomorrow. But even in silence, a kind of reflection would bloom. Maybe she would think about her own mother, remembering the scent of her clothes, the sound of her voice at bedtime. Maybe she would think of her children, where they might go, who they might become. Or perhaps she thought of no one, just sat with the hush of night and let her thoughts settle like dust in a quiet room. In the ancient world, there were no diaries for most women, no portraits, no statues in their honor. But memory, true memory, does not need a monument. It lives in breath, in rhythm, in what is passed from one heart to another without words. Some women might have watched the stars, naming them not as astronomers did, but in stories. That one looked like a basket. That one reminded them of a sister lost. Some might have whispered a prayer, not always to gods carved in stone, but to whatever spirit they believed could hear. A river, a tree, the moon itself. It is easy now to forget how little they had. A woman might own nothing of her own, not her clothes, not her home, not even her name once married, and yet within her she carried everything, the stories, the knowledge, the strength. She remembered the dates of planting and harvest. She remembered which child had a fever last spring. She remembered songs that calmed infants and recipes that stretched into meals. And in those evenings, in that quiet, perhaps she allowed herself a single wish. Not a grand one, not for gold or freedom, perhaps just that tomorrow would be a little softer, that her children would be safe, that she could sleep a little longer without being woken. Across time and distance, across languages and lands, that wish has remained almost the same. The hope for gentleness, the hope for peace, the hope to rest. Tonight, as you lie still and calm, you become part of that lineage. You are held by it. The long line of those who gave so much without asking, who were rarely named but never absent, who knew the value of silence, who made life bearable not by changing the world, but by softening it from within. Let that thought wrap around you now. You are not asked to remember every date, every empire, every war. Just remember the feeling, the warmth of a quiet room, the hush of evening, the touch of a tired hand still offering comfort. There is no need to hurry, no need to worry. History will wait. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breath grow deep. You are not alone. You are part of something older than kingdoms, older than roads and stone. You are part of care itself. And now, as night deepens, there is nothing more to do. Only to rest, only to drift, only to sleep.
The ancient world, though filled with noise during the day, markets shouting, animals braying, children calling, always seemed to settle into a gentler rhythm by night.
And in that gentle dark, women often became the quiet center of the home. Their hands no longer scrubbing or stirring, but smoothing blankets, tracing patterns on worn fabric, or simply resting in their laps. There was a certain wisdom in their stillness, a kind of unspoken understanding that the world could be chaotic, but the home needed calm. Not because anyone gave them this role, but because they made it themselves, out of necessity, out of habit, out of love. In many places, there were no books on motherhood or guides to household life. Women learned from watching, from remembering, from listening. And what they knew was passed down not in formal lessons, but in small gestures. How to hold a baby when it cried in a particular way. How to mend a tear with thread that would not show. How to make a little food stretch a little further. Their knowledge was quiet, like the hush of the earth at dusk. Some lived in stone houses, some in huts of reeds or mud, others in tents that moved with the seasons. But all had a place they returned to, a corner of the world they kept in order even when nothing else could be controlled, a place where firelight danced on walls, where the smell of cooked grain lingered, where sleep was something earned, not taken for granted. And sometimes even the most burdened woman found time to dream. Not all dreams were grand. Sometimes they were simple. To hear laughter again. To feel the sun on her back without work to be done. To have one day when no one called her name, no one asked anything of her, and she could just be still and herself. But there were deeper dreams too, ones she didn't say aloud, dreams of a world where her daughter could walk unguarded, where her voice could carry as far as a man's, where her life was measured not by how much she gave, but by who she was. Of course, such a world felt distant, impossible even. Still, she kept those dreams close, not because she believed she'd see them, but because hope was a form of endurance, and enduring was something she had mastered. There were women who healed, not just scraped knees and fevers, but heartbreak, the quiet kind, when a child grew distant or a husband returned colder than he had left. There were women who listened, not with judgment, but with the kind of attention that said, "I know. I've felt that too." This, too, was a kind of medicine. And though they rarely spoke of it, many women carried grief that had never been named, the loss of babies never born, of love never returned, of freedom never granted. They carried it in their shoulders, in their breath, in their silence, and still they rose each morning. Perhaps that is what makes their lives so powerful. Not in what they were allowed, but in what they managed despite it all, despite the fear, despite the pain, despite being told again and again to be small,
They found ways to hold everything together. Not with fire, not with force, but with care, with patience, with a kind of strength that asked for no praise. Now, as you lie in your own quiet space, think of those hands across time, across lands that once smoothed linen, lit lamps, and cradled sleeping children. Hands that made meals without recipes, who nursed without training, who gave without asking. Their touch may never have been recorded, but it shaped the world. And maybe that's why their history was forgotten, because it was made of things we cannot see: warmth, comfort, rhythm, and quiet. But that doesn't make it less real. In fact, it may be the most lasting part of all. Close your eyes now, if they aren't already. Let go of the day. Let go of the lists, the worries, the unfinished things. You are not alone. You are part of something ancient, something gentle, something that has always waited patiently for you to rest. Let the night deepen. Let the world grow softer. There is nothing more to do. You have done enough. You are enough. Sleep now.
There were no loud victories for most women in the ancient world, no songs sung in their names, no parades for their quiet endurance. And yet every day they carried the weight of life itself, steadily, without applause. They were the ones who made homes from bare earth, who kept fire burning through storm and drought, who remembered everything so that others could forget. Each morning they stepped into motion without pause. The baby needed feeding. The older child needed guiding. The grains needed grinding. The water needed carrying. These were not tasks listed in scrolls or carved in stone, but they were the tasks that held everything together. Without them, the temples would crumble, the feasts would vanish, the cities would falter. And though their days were long and their rest was often short, they still found small ways to create beauty. A flower tucked into a clay jar, a braid tied with care, a lullaby hummed as the stars blinked into view. None of these gestures were grand, but they were deliberate. They were quiet offerings to a world that asked so much, yet rarely gave back. Evenings brought a different kind of stillness. The sun sank low, casting amber light through narrow windows. Smoke curled upward from small fires. The sounds softened. And in that hush, women would gather their thoughts, not in journals, but in their hearts. Sometimes they looked out into the distance and wondered what else there might be, beyond the walls, beyond the hills, beyond the boundaries they had always been told not to cross. But even their thoughts were limited by custom. It was not safe to want too much. It was not safe to speak too freely. So they dreamed in fragments, in silence. In some villages, stories were passed from woman to woman, not for entertainment, but for survival.
warnings dressed as tales, lessons woven into legends. A story about a girl who wandered too far, a tale about a wife who spoke out, a fable of a goddess punished for being bold. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were maps of what to avoid, of how to stay safe. And even so, danger often came anyway. Sometimes from strangers, often from those closest to them. Because the world was not built to protect them. Not their minds, not their bodies, not their choices. And yet, despite this, they remained. They adapted. They learned to read moods in a single glance, to calm storms before they formed. They became caretakers of peace, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. In the privacy of night, when others had gone to sleep, a woman might sit by a dying ember and let her shoulders fall. No more pretending, no more smiling, just herself, as she was. Tired maybe, sad maybe, even angry, but alive, still breathing, still here. And in that moment she might remember something kind. The first laugh of her child, the scent of her sister's hair when they were young, the way her mother used to hum. These fragments of joy were small, but real. They kept her anchored when nothing else made sense. She might whisper a prayer, not to gods of thunder or war, but to something simpler, maybe just to the night itself. A wish for one more quiet morning, for fewer burdens, for softer days. Her prayer may not have been heard, but she made it anyway. That, too, was an act of hope. Now, as you lie still, you carry the memory of women like her, not in your mind, but in your breath, in your quiet, in the way you too seek peace at the end of a long day. You do not need to know their names to honor them. You do not need to understand every part of history to feel the weight they carried. It is enough to remember that they existed, and that they mattered. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let your limbs soften. There is no more to fix, no more to prove. The fire has burned low. The air is cool. The night is kind. Sleep, knowing you are part of something ancient and good. Sleep, knowing that rest is not laziness, but legacy.
There was a rhythm to life in the ancient world, a slow and steady repetition of tasks, of gestures, of quiet duties passed down through generations. For many women, this rhythm was the shape of their days and their years. It began early, before light brushed the rooftops, and ended only when the moon had climbed high and the last fire died down. She would wake before the house stirred, sometimes to the sound of birds, sometimes to nothing but silence. Her body knew the morning long before her eyes opened, the aches, the stiffness, the heaviness in her limbs. They were familiar companions. She did not rush. She moved through her small space, gathering the day with slow hands. Water first, then fire, then warmth for others.
This was not remarkable. It was not remembered. It did not change history. And yet, it was everything. There were grains to sort, flour to grind, dough to shape. There were mouths to feed and wounds to bind. There were animals to tend, coals to bank, fabric to mend. If she paused, even for a moment, the weight of it all pressed in. So she did not pause often. But sometimes, when the sun was just beginning to rise, she would step outside. The air would still be cool, damp with the breath of the night. She would lift her face to the sky and close her eyes, not to pray, not to wish, but simply to feel. The day always returned quickly. Her tasks called her back, and yet that single breath of morning stayed with her, tucked quietly beneath the layers of work that followed. She spoke softly when she was allowed to speak. She listened often, not always to the words around her, but to the unspoken things. Moods shifting in a room, anger hiding behind a glance, sorrow settling into a silence. She had learned to read those signs long ago. It kept her safe. It kept others calm. Children clung to her, not because she was always kind, but because she was always there. They watched her hands as she worked, learned her movements. They copied her tone, her posture, her habits. She was their world, though they would not know it until she was gone. She comforted them with quiet gestures, a blanket adjusted, a song hummed, a story whispered at the edge of sleep. She did not always have time for tenderness, but she gave what she could. Often, that was more than enough. As she aged, her strength faded. Her hands became slower, her back bent lower, but her presence grew heavier, more respected, even if never publicly praised. Younger women came to her not for permission, but for reassurance. They saw in her something solid, something that did not shift with the winds. She remembered things others had forgotten. The way someone used to laugh, the time a flood had nearly taken the fields, the recipe that worked when nothing else did. Her memory was not celebrated, but it was needed. Without her, the thread would break. She taught without teaching. Her daughters learned how to endure from the way she moved through pain. They learned how to wait from the way she handled disappointment. They learned to care, not because she told them to, but because she never stopped doing so herself. Not all her days were good. Some were heavy with grief. A child lost, a friend buried, a harvest ruined. On those days she moved more slowly, but she moved, always. Her heart had been broken many times, though she rarely said so. She did not speak of the things that haunted her, the night she felt truly alone, the time she feared for her life, the moment she realized no one was coming to save her. She carried those memories in the same way she carried everything else, with quiet strength. Sometimes, when the world had gone still, she would sit alone. Her hands would rest in her lap. Her eyes would search the fire, not for warmth, but for understanding. She wondered, perhaps, what her life had meant, if anyone would remember her name, if anything she had done would matter in the end. And yet, she did not regret, not entirely. She had known laughter. She had heard music. She had touched the earth with bare feet and held a newborn to her chest. She had created meals out of almost nothing. She had dried tears and buried the dead and planted seeds that outlived her. This, too, was a kind of legacy. She had not written history, but she had lived it. Her hands had turned the wheels of daily life. Her voice had shaped generations. Her presence had softened the world. And now, as you listen, her story moves through you. You too have known long days. You too have carried more than your share. Perhaps you've wondered if anyone sees the work you do, the care you give, the patience you practice. Perhaps you've questioned your worth in a world that values loudness over consistency. But rest now. Rest in the truth that you belong to a long and powerful line of women who endured not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. They chose to love, to serve, to hold, to soften, to build. And they chose to continue, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. You are part of that story now. Let your body be still. Let your breath settle. You are safe here. The world can wait. You have done enough for today. Sleep not to escape, but to return to yourself, to your place in this ancient, unbroken chain of care. Let their quiet strength hold you. Let their memory cradle you.
In the ancient world, days flowed into nights with gentle inevitability. The sun descended slowly behind hills or temple walls, and the world softened beneath its fading light. For many women, the end of day was not a moment of relief, but simply a shift, one phase of work giving way to another. The fires were stoked again. Meals were prepared with whatever had been gathered. Children were soothed. Elders were tended, and wounds from the day, both seen and unseen, were quietly acknowledged. No one asked her how she was feeling. No one handed her rest. But somehow, in the quiet spaces between tasks, she found stillness. Just a flicker, a breath, a moment where no one called her name. And often that was enough. She would sit near the fire, not because it was cold, but because the flame gave something familiar. Its gentle flicker, its warm hum, it reminded her that something in the world was steady, even if nothing else was. Sometimes she would hum softly, not from joy exactly, but from habit, a tune her mother had sung, one that carried through generations like a thread. She didn't think of it as music. It was just something to fill the silence, something to hold on to. And if she was lucky, she would find a small task that belonged to her alone, mending a garment with quiet precision, grinding herbs for a tonic she might never use, folding cloth with slow hands. These were not duties, they were anchors. In those moments, no one needed her to explain herself. She could simply be, and though her body ached and her mind wandered to the next day's burdens, that pause made a difference. It reminded her she was still human, not just a vessel for labor, not just a figure in the shadows, but a person, a woman with memories, a woman with thoughts that stretched beyond the walls of her home. Sometimes, while others slept, she would lie awake under the stars. If the sky was clear, she might trace the constellations with her eyes, the stories told about them, the gods, the heroes, the monsters. They were always about men, about battles and quests, about power. She wondered, quietly, what story the stars told about her. There were no statues built in her name. No scrolls recorded her deeds. No epic poems praised her kindness. And yet she had shaped the world in ways no one could measure. She had quieted storms of anger with a glance. She had lifted spirits with a simple touch. She had taught love by example. And when everything else failed, she remained. Not because she had no choice, but because something within her refused to disappear. There were women like her in every village, every town, every forgotten corner of the ancient world. Women who bore their days with patience, who knew the language of eyes and silence, who carried generations on their backs without recognition. And somehow they endured. They endured through sorrow and hunger, through disappointment and confinement, through childbirth, through loss, through the deep fatigue that comes from being needed but never noticed. They endured because they had each other,
even when they couldn't speak freely, even when their friendship was measured in glances and quiet support. There was a strength in the way one woman handed another a bowl of warm broth, in the way they shared tools, shared burdens, shared the ache of what might never be. They built a silent network, woven from shared experience. Their power didn't echo in halls of stone. It whispered in kitchens and courtyards, in the shade of olive trees, in the small sacred spaces they carved from ordinary moments. A woman tending to her neighbor's wound, another keeping a child while the mother wept. These were not grand gestures, they were lifelines, invisible to the scribes, but essential to the world. And sometimes, in the hush of night, when her work was done and her body stilled, she let herself imagine. She imagined a different world, not one without pain. Pain was part of life, but a world where her voice mattered, where her hands created not only survival, but joy, where her name would be remembered, not as someone great, but as someone good, someone whole. And though she would never speak that dream aloud, it lived in her. It lit something small and glowing deep inside, a candle no one could see, but that she kept carefully burning. And now, as you rest, you carry that same light. Maybe your days are not marked by carrying water or baking bread, but the feeling is familiar. The quiet endurance, the steady care, the way you move through the world while asking for so little. You too know what it means to hold others together, to give more than you take, to keep going even when the path is steep. So as this night deepens, let that candle glow inside you. Let it remind you that you come from a long line of women who were never named in books, but who made everything possible. They are with you now in memory and in spirit. Let them surround you with gentleness. Let their calm wash over you. You are not alone in your rest. You are part of something vast and tender. Let the stars hold your dreams. Let the quiet of the night cradle you. You have done enough. You are enough.
In the final hush of night, when the world falls deepest into stillness, it is easier to imagine what we can't always see. The ancient streets long worn away, the footsteps lost to time, the quiet women whose names were never spoken again. But even if history forgot their names, it did not erase their presence. They live on, not in marble, not in scrolls, not in myths, but in the softness passed from one hand to the next, in the quiet knowledge carried from mother to daughter, in the unbroken thread of care that stretches from then to now. She is there still in the small things, in the warm cup placed beside a loved one's bed, in the silent folding of a blanket, in the tired sigh at the end of a long day, in the way someone hums while washing dishes, not even knowing why. All of it echoes back. We often think of power as loud, as something that claims space and commands attention. But her power was not loud. It never needed to be. It moved differently, quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface. It shaped the world not by force, but by presence. She did not raise armies, but she raised people. She did not conquer lands, but she cultivated trust. She did not leave monuments, but she left memories. And those memories, even unspoken, lived on, in habits, in gestures, in the way a hand reaches out without thinking. She gave the world continuity, even when she received no credit at all. Tonight, as you lie here resting, breathing, listening, you are part of that continuity. You may have never thought of yourself as connected to the past, but in the way you offer comfort, in the way you endure, in the way you remain steady, there is something ancient in you, something deeply human, something quietly heroic. Perhaps no one will ever write books about you. Perhaps you will not be remembered for speeches or victories, but you will be remembered, if not by name, then by how you made others feel, by the way your kindness lingered, by the way your calm softened even the hardest of days. She too lived that way. Each night she closed her eyes without knowing if her efforts had mattered. And still she rose each morning and did them again. She gave without guarantee, loved without applause, built without blueprint. And because of her, the world turned. You can let that truth settle over you now. You don't need to earn rest. You don't need to prove anything. You have already done more than enough. There's nothing left for you to carry tonight. Let it all go. Let the worries slip away. Let the questions grow quiet. Let your thoughts grow slower, softer. Breathe in and out. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your jaw unclench. Let the small tension behind your eyes dissolve. You are not alone in this moment. The quiet women who came before you, who folded bread, who soothed fevers, who listened without being asked, surround you now, not as ghosts, but as warmth. You carry their strength, their patience, their quiet beauty. And now you give yourself what they rarely received: a full breath, a full pause, a full night of peace. This is not the end of your story. It is simply a rest, a sacred one. You may return to the world tomorrow, to its noise, its needs, its demands. But not yet. Tonight is only for you. The sky outside may be dark, but inside, a light glows. It comes from that long line of women who kept going. It lives in your breath, in your heartbeat, in your presence. No crown sits on your head. No robe wraps around your shoulders. And yet you hold a kind of quiet royalty. One earned not through wealth or war, but through care. So close your eyes now. Feel your body supported. Feel the bed beneath you, steady and safe. Feel the world grow softer with each breath. Nothing is required of you in this moment. You do not need to try. You do not need to fix. You only need to rest. Sleep now not because you are weak, but because you are human. Because you have given and held and carried, and now you deserve to stop, to simply be, to drift into that deep, gentle place inside yourself where everything slows and everything softens.